Welcome to Light It Up, a podcast about resilient women balancing motherhood, their careers, personal lives, and all of the challenges that come along with being a superwoman. Each week, you'll be motivated to take action to lead, inspire, transform, and empower. Now, here's your host, Dr. Aginah. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Light It Up. I am very excited about this episode, as I am excited about each and every episode of Light It Up. First, I'd like to take an opportunity, of course, to thank those of you who have continued to listen to the podcast. Thank you for choosing to listen once again this week. And I'd also like to thank those of you who are new to listening to Light It Up. I hope that you will find something with today's episode that is enlightening. And also with every other episode that I've recorded, I hope that there is something that is shared that helps you throughout your day, throughout your week, and throughout this journey called life. A few weeks ago, I mentioned that I was going to do something different where I was going to bring on guests to Light It Up. And a couple of episodes ago, I had Dr. Robin Gobin, who talked about self-care, also talked about mental health and the importance of making sure that we are taking care of our mental health. This week, I want to tackle a topic that is very important, but is rarely talked about openly. And I want to warn you that the topic today may be a little sensitive, but it is very, very timely. I'm sure that many of you have seen the news reports highlighting the fact that as more Americans across the country are forced to stay at home, and maybe I shouldn't use the terminology of being forced, but as we are sheltering in place and as we are staying at home during COVID-19, this crisis has essentially created a pressure cooker situation for domestic violence victims. And while domestic violence is an issue that has always caused concern for so many, during this time period is even more concerning. So it's a topic that I felt compelled to explore, and I want to present to you today. I have three very distinguished guests who will provide information about violence against women, specifically domestic violence and sexual assault. Today's guests are Adrienne Spires. Adrienne is a training and technical assistance coordinator with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Adrienne is based out of California. She's originally from the state of Illinois, Champaign specifically. But Adrienne likes to foster collaborative relationships with various constituents, including social service programs, countywide initiatives, faith-rooted organizations, state and federal agencies. She's had a decade of professional experience contributing to organizations that help empower and heal women and youth who have suffered sexual assault and trauma, specifically in the state of Illinois. So, like I said, she is from the state of Illinois. She's currently based in California. Second guest is Sa'idah Sudan. And Sa'idah is a sexual assault and domestic violence advocate. Sa'idah is actually the first and only Muslim woman in the state of New Jersey that was certified for domestic violence. She's also a member of the New Jersey Coalition for Battered Women in Trenton, New Jersey, the Domestic Violence Advocacy Council in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the North Carolina Coalition for Domestic Violence in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm really pleased to be able to have Sa'idah as a guest today, because I think it's very admirable and commendable that she is actually the first and only Muslim woman to have the domestic violence certification. She's going to share some information with us today that I think that you'll find very informative. But her call to this particular work was based upon the fact that she felt that there was a grave need for Muslim and non-Muslim, as well as immigrant women, to be sheltered from vulnerability and physical harm. So I'm very excited about hearing from Sa'idah. And my third guest is LaSandra Hutchinson. She's a domestic violence advocate and social entrepreneur. She has been advocating for the rights and well-being of women and girls as a high school student. So she's been doing this for a number of years, where she worked on various citywide workshops related to teen dating violence and self-worth for young women in the Chicago area. LaSandra is currently based in the south suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, where she works for the South Suburban Family Shelter. She's also founded Grace and Grief, which is an initiative that builds the capacity of others to grow through grief and live bodily after loss. And so this is an online community. She also speaks to various groups and also has coaching services available, a blog and YouTube. So just incredible work that she is doing. So I wanted to bring these three ladies together. It was actually, I will say by the grace of God, that actually these three women came together and are now serving as my guests today for the show. I was looking for someone to talk about domestic violence, and I reached out to Adrienne initially. And because I remember some conversations that we had in her work that she does related to sexual assault. And she connected me to Sa'idah. And maybe a few days later or a day later, LaSandra posted on Facebook and she was talking about her work that she does related to domestic violence. And I reached out to her and she said yes. And so as a result, I have three very distinguished women who have agreed to share some information with each of you related to domestic violence and sexual assault against women. So I am excited about this show. I'm excited about the possibilities of continuing to bring very timely and relevant information to you. And so I'd like to, without further ado, go ahead and introduce my three guests to each of you. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the three of you for joining me for another episode of Lite It Up podcast. I am very pleased to have the three of you come on and talk about a very important subject that impacts so many people, but particularly women. Mm-hmm. So I want to welcome you, Adrienne Spires. And Adrienne, you are project coordinator for the Faith Rooted Collaborative and Leadership Education Advancement for Professionals. You're based with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Right. Mm-hmm. I always mix that up because I want to call it a collaborative. And then we have Sa'idah Sudan, who is based out of North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And Sa'idah, you have experience in domestic violence advocacy. I'll give you all an opportunity to share your background with the listeners, but I just wanted to get the quick introduction in. And then LaSandra Hutchinson, you are here based in the south suburbs of Chicago.
Yep.
And you're with the South Suburban
Family Shelter.
Yes.
So,
thank you all for joining me. I reached out to you guys probably about a week ago because I really wanted to have an opportunity to talk to those of you who are working in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, because obviously we know it's an issue, and it's been an issue for years. And it's also a topic that we don't necessarily talk about in the Black community. Um, but I think what prompted me to want to reach out to you all is the fact that now we're all sheltering in place with COVID-19. And I've seen a number of reports on the news about the spike in calls to law enforcement related to domestic violence. And so I thought that this was a good time to start talking about this topic. We've also talked about doing a series because obviously we can't tackle all of the issues related to this very important topic in one episode. So what I want to do is first give you all an opportunity to just share your background and what led you to make the decision to work in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy. So, Adrienne, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I am originally from Chicago. I would say Champaign, Illinois, by way of Chicago. So I was born and raised in Chicago. And unfortunately, I am a DV survivor. And I say unfortunate because, you know, I married my high school sweetheart, who was this gentleman. But unfortunately, throughout our marriage, the middle and the latter part of our marriage, he was no longer gentle, right? And so with me becoming this victim of DV and then unfortunately becoming a non-offending parent, I had to learn about sexual assault and domestic violence through systems and through healing and through trauma. And then I started going into mental health and education. But I came into this field because I realized that sexual assault and domestic violence was interconnected it was a part of social ills and it impacted our community. And unfortunately, it's such a silence in our community, and the services for our community and the support for our community is quite limited. And a lot of times, a lot of the practitioners and the decision makers in domestic violence and sexual assault, the anti-sexual violence field, there's not a lot of women of color, particularly Black women in decision-making positions. And so if we have high numbers as victim survivors in the movement, we tend to use those two words interchangeably. If we're not there to make decisions and help guide and shape and reshape policies and procedures and practices, it's going to be very challenging for our communities, especially for Black women, Black girls, to get on a path of healing. And most importantly, how do we have in-depth conversations around strategic prevention? So that's why I'm here. And I really enjoy working in this field, but there are some days that it's overwhelming because it's like we are constantly talking about the same thing and the results are not as, we don't have the best outcomes sometimes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And Sa'idah, if you could just share with us your background and how you came to work in the field.
Will do. Hi, I really thank you for having me here. I have to piggyback off of everything Adrienne has said, but I'm going to add a little more. I came into this field working in a level 1 trauma hospital, and I have not seen Muslim women come into the ER for domestic abuse until this very one day that I did. um, I didn't understand and couldn't wrap my head around it because this religion is supposed to be so, well, it is. Our religion is a loving religion. It is a nonviolent religion. And to see someone come into the ER that looked like me made me want to get into the minds of the abusers because I really couldn't understand your religious aspect to what just happened to this young lady. So one thing led to another, and I started going to classes, and that one day led to 5 years to where I was certified in domestic violence. Being certified in domestic violence, it wasn't only about the Muslim women, it was actually about the non-Muslim women, because they have the same um, problems that we have when it comes to domestic violence. But then I had to add on the immigrant women, who their background and their family meshes their culture with the religion. So if you didn't know better, you would think from a Muslim point of view, it's allowed, but it really isn't allowed. So I am actually from Newark, New Jersey, moving to Charlotte. I opened I brought my agency here. Bringing my agency here, I'm in the South. So there are not a lot of women that look like me anyway. So that was a challenge. Then it's a challenge where you're trying to help the immigrant women, and they're not really understanding why there's another Muslim that is working with domestic violence. So I had a lot of challenges coming to the South, but it worked out. And the good thing is I'm trusting. So they trust me. They come to me, they call, because this is a very bad epidemic in the Muslim community, in the non-Muslim community, and in the immigrant community. So I ended up here doing the same work that I did in New Jersey, but I wanted to offer more. So I had a lot of help and a sponsor, and the sponsor is Penny Appeal USA, who have helped us in our agency and is now helping us open our first Muslim-run domestic violence shelter. Because it's Muslim-run, does that mean all Muslims will be there? We are taking any woman, any victim that is subject to abuse with their children.
Wow.
But so I thank you for inviting me to allow to get this out, to get this word out that there is help.
Thank you so much. And Sandra.
Yeah, thank you, Aginah, for thank you for having this, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I actually started working in violence prevention when I was in high school. Some friends and I had an opportunity to write a grant and receive funding from a foundation called the Girls Best Friend Foundation at the time. And so we had an opportunity to collaborate with the Illinois Center for Violence Prevention to design and implement a series of workshops for young women in Chicago. And so we had professional speakers come in and talk about teen dating violence and conflict management and self-worth, things that we felt were important for our peers and for ourselves to learn about. And so like that started this journey for me. After I went to undergrad and I graduated, I went back and worked for that same organization, for the Illinois Center for Violence Prevention. And I basically began work on the prevention side. And so I would travel throughout the state, training young women on the dynamics of teen dating violence and helping them create actions in their own community, and to also grant write and receive funding to fund their actions to make a difference in their community around violence. So I think that really was like where my passion was birthed. So since that time, I've worked in a variety of different capacities, some volunteer and some working at different nonprofits, and then also doing some grant writing and legislative drafting for some of the Illinois state representatives around policy that affects women and girls. And it really, though, was very personal. I had a friend that I had known for 10 years, and it was interesting because she had never mentioned her husband much, even if I asked about him. And I would say, how's he doing? How's the family? She was very, what I thought was private. But one day I was with her and he came to where we were and basically like tried to assault her in my presence. And so I like stood up and intervened in the situation, and later started to share. It was in the month of October, which is a DV, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I started to share resources about how to get an order of protection, about domestic violence shelters on Facebook. And people started to privately DM me, people that I knew either from elementary school, high school, college, and share their stories with me. And they basically were saying, like, thank you for sharing this information. You don't know this about me, but I'm also a victim survivor of domestic violence. And so at that time, that was when I was like, oh my God, this is affecting everybody, because these were women who were of all different demographics, different races, different levels of education, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And I think even more so the impact of how prevalent this is and how it spans across every background really impacted me. And so at that point, that was when I did the 40-hour training in Illinois, and then also got involved with court advocacy, and learning how to hold the judicial system accountable for how they treat victims or survivors when they come in to get an order of protection. So yeah, it's my journey.
It's interesting because as I was listening to each of you and your backgrounds, I can relate to each one of you. So I shared on a separate call that I think when I was maybe 20, 21, that I was dating someone who, it was kind of subtle. First, it was the isolating me from friends and family. And then there was a physical altercation, but I fought back. So I didn't remain in the relationship, but I certainly did not share with other people what was going on until I felt like I was at a point where I needed help. And primarily it was because I am Muslim. I was born and raised as a Muslim. My family had expectations that whoever I date should be a Muslim, and that individual was not. So part of me struggled with the fact that I felt like I was maybe doing something wrong. Not that I deserved to be in this type of relationship, but I think I felt like, well, had I not been dating this person that my parents didn't want me to date in the first place, this would not have happened. So I think, as victims, you go through this process of blaming yourself, thinking that there's something that you did to deserve it. And then I have a really close friend who was in an abusive relationship as well. So I know both sides of being in that situation, having a friend that's in that situation or had been in that situation. And then also I worked for the Cook County Sheriff's Department in the Youth Services Division. So I went through the certification training. We established programs in the schools centered toward teen dating violence, because that was also an issue. And that was in the 90s, but still the work still has to continue. So I really appreciate the background that you all share and how we're able to, to connect to talk about this topic. So what I'd like to do is first, for people who don't know, when you think of domestic violence, more than likely the first thing that comes to mind is the physical abuse. So Adrienne, if you could just share with us what is domestic violence, and then what are some of the different forms of domestic violence? If you could just.
Yeah, so I'll just sum it up real quick. Domestic violence is when the victim encounters some type of emotional or psychological or physical mismanagement or maltreatment from a significant other. And it becomes this cycle. And so people sometimes will say, well, why she just didn't leave? And so it's a honeymoon phase, right? And then we have the tension phase, and then we have this phase that it's just abrupt, right? It becomes this violent phase. And so when you think about domestic violence, people will say why she didn't leave, but in the beginning of any relationship, if anyone ever exhibit any type of violent behavior, the first time you meet them, first time impressions, you will leave, right? But it's this cycle. And so you may have a spat or disagreement or some type of, you may experience something that you didn't experience before with this particular person that you have this intimate relationship with. Then that particular perpetrator / abuser will come back and be very apologetic. I will never do that again. And so it's sort of like having a a disagreement, and then you figure out, okay, well, we talked this through, we're going to work this through. And then you may have another situation, and it doesn't mean it's going to be back to back, and it could come back around maybe months later, and then it's this tension building. And so the apologies become less than, and then accountability from the perpetrator is now thrust on the victim. And then it becomes this moment where it could be deadly, right? And it's hard to leave because they have groomed you, right? They have groomed you. A lot of times they will isolate you. That's huge. A lot of people are totally unaware of isolation. It appears that they want to spend all this time with you, but a lot of times they're taking the time that you could be spending with yourself and with family members. And so you're building this illusion like a bond, and this perpetrator is basically building you up so he can have power and control. And I say we know that there are some males that are abused, but overwhelmingly there's women. And so we're talking about women today. So I'm not being dismissive of males, but I do want people to know that overwhelmingly the victims of domestic violence are women and girls.
And you mentioned power and control as being the root of domestic violence. LaSandra, if you could maybe share, because Adrienne touched on the fact that the overwhelming majority of the victims of domestic violence are women. Do you have any data that you could share with us, perhaps about the percentages of women who are victims of domestic violence, and then also race, economic status, and how, what are, in addition to that, what are some of the warning signs? Because Adrienne mentioned, when you first engage in a relationship with someone, they're going to show you their best selves. So you're in the honeymoon phase anyway, at the beginning stages of a relationship. But are there key warning signs that, a woman should look out for?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Data shows that 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of domestic violence or domestic abuse from an intimate partner in their lifetime. And then the stats vary among men. It usually is around 1 in 7 or 1 in 9. Men are less likely to report. So it's always hard to really nail down that data. But it crosses all racial backgrounds, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all levels of education, is a global, universal experience. So I think that the prevalence of it just shines the light on how important it is for us to understand the dynamics, and to also just build awareness. And some of the red flags are that usually an abuser wants to move fast. So they met you a week ago, they want to marry you a month later. So that's a red flag. Even when I have friends that are dating and they tell me things like that happen, and they're very, they're feeling wooed off their feet or swept off their feet, I'm always alarmed, because I know from this training that really that's not a good sign in most cases. Like, that's kind of something to be concerned about, why someone would want you to move in with them. Often an abuser because they want power and control, they will also isolate you, as Adrienne also explained, from family and friends. Jealousy is a huge issue. Also, they often use financial abuse, and also they'll use technology abuse or property abuse. So wanting to see your phone, wanting to have access to everything, your accounts, your Facebook, your social media. Again, as Adrienne explained, the cycle of violence is usually that after some type of incident of violence, there's a honeymoon phase, but then a tension building phase. And it is confusing, because that cycle could take a week, it could take a few months, it could take a year or more than a year. And so sometimes you'll find a woman or someone that's been in a domestic violence, an intimate partner relationship where they've been experiencing domestic violence for 20 years, but they can pinpoint there were years where it was good, and then there were these years where it wasn't. And so like when you step back and kind of look at the panoramic picture of it, you can see that there was a cycle all along. So that's another warning sign. And just in general, an abuser usually has a persona, a public persona, that they are highly, highly charming, very charismatic, and usually the only person that would really know they were abusive is the victim.
Okay, so that brought back some memories right when you said the charming persona, where a person, so if a woman was to say, you know, I'm in an abusive relationship, 9 times out of 10, if they told someone, they're not going to believe them because that's not the side of the individual that they see. Sa'idah, you know, we often focus on physical violence. LaSandra touched on the emotional, the financial abuse. Can you kind of talk through some of the ways in which an abuser can use finances as a way, you know, of, I guess, abusing their victim or their spouse or significant other?
For the most part, sometimes if she has a job and he doesn't, once she goes to work, she has to give him her check. She has no money. That's abuse. They both can work, but he still wants her money. There are times when he has taken everything from her in terms of financial. She doesn't even have bus fare to get to the courthouse if she wanted to file charges against him. But the financial abuse that they have is he holds the checkbook. Most of the times, some of my clients don't know how to write out a check because they never did it. They don't have the name on the bank account. She can't go to the bank and try to withdraw money. I mean, she can't even get there to do that. So the financial part, he doesn't put her on anything, you know, no utilities, no nothing, because if she decides to leave him, he's already set up. So that financial part is very, very important. He may leave her with no money to feed the kids, which will hurt her. Anything he can do sometimes to hurt her, that is exactly what he do.
And that in and of itself is also emotional abuse as well. So what I want to do, because I know we have some time constraints here, I want to, if we can, talk about just the fact that we're currently in this state of affairs. We're, like I said, we're sheltering in place. Some of us are working remotely from home or not. How has, during this pandemic, what can victims do to, I guess, protect themselves while they are in the home with their abuser? I don't know who should take this question. And maybe Adrienne, if you want to kind of give a few minutes.
Sure. So I'm thinking the conversation that we had before this podcast, and just listening to Sa'idah. So Sa'idah, I'm going to share some of your information because I don't work in DV, I work in SA, but it still interconnects. But just the things that Sa'idah shared was just very important, and I'm not sure if some of the victims are aware. Just trying to protect themselves at home. Always being mindful where certain items are that can be actual weapons against them. Staying close to their children. If you have knives, like, do not have them in the, what is it called?
The block?
Yes, and put them in the kitchen, in the cupboard somewhere. Also, I just think that I'm highly concerned because I'm thinking about with this pandemic, it is really showing that we truly are a classism society, right? And it's really showing how like they have certain people, organizations are trying to figure out ways to communicate with potential victims or victims. And some of it is due to technology. And so as Sa'idah just stated, in finances and emotions, sometimes perpetrators make sure that their victims don't even have access to the basic needs. And so I'm highly concerned that some of these women are going to have to think from a fear factor, survival factor, walking on eggshells and potato chips, trying to figure out how not to, I'm not saying that victims are the reasons why they are being abused, but trying to figure out ways to keep that environment as calm as possible. But I'm going to go back to what Sa'idah shared about being mindful of the items in the home that can be weapons and trying to put them away, try to stay close to your children. And if you have to flee, you could just leave. And some abusers do not abuse the victims in front of the children, even though the children may hear it. And that's still another form of abuse for the children. It's indirect. I think also just hoping that the victims have some support systems where they can have a conversation, someone can check on them, just to say, oh, due to the pandemic, do you have toilet paper? That's a big thing. Some people are laughing about that, but that is a necessity. Whatever you have to use to try to have a conversation in order to get in contact with them, even if someone is calling and saying, I just want to make sure that, you know, your children have what they need to complete their assignments since they're no longer in school? Or is there something we could do to assist you to make sure that you're able to fulfill your roles and responsibilities at your place of employment? Or if they are part of a faith community, you know, we're having some events online, or we just want to check up on you and make sure that you're okay. I am just being honest that I'm highly concerned that some women that are being victimized don't have the tools that they need to be safe within that home while they're sheltered in.
You know, Adrienne, there's something, let me just, I want to get one point in, and because Sa'idah, I do want you to expound on that. So I just wanted, there was something that I wanted to ask you, Adrienne, because as you did mention that you work in the area of sexual assault. Can you, if you can, and Sa'idah, we're going to come back to that piece, but if you could, because I don't think that people think about the fact that if you are married, right, that your spouse can sexually assault you, sexually abuse you. So if you could just touch on that, I don't want to negate that at all. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I also think about, you know, sexual assault. So people think that just because you're married that you can't be sexually assaulted by your intimate partner and or your spouse. Sexual assault basically is the lack of consent. If the victim does not consent to have sexual activity with you, that is considered sexual assault or rape. Depending on the state that you reside in, that's how they recognize it. And it can happen. And so once again, there's an interconnection of domestic violence and sexual assault, because if your power is taken from you, from finances, emotional, psychological, and physical, overwhelmingly your sexual, you to provide consent for sexual activity is taken away as well. And so we know, well, maybe we don't, a lot of people don't know, but sexual assault is another form of power and control, to take your power, to belittle you, to minimize you, right? It's a form of intimidation. It's not just about the sexual act, it's about shaming you and belittling you. And that happens a lot. So we think about that happens in society when there are, you know, we have war, we have these conversations with women who were victims of sexual violence. And we think about refugees and why a lot of them come over here, right? Because they are fleeing from domestic violence, sexual assault. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're fleeing from sexual assault from their intimate partner or their spouse. They're also fleeing because that's a form of power and control, and to minimize and intimidate women, especially if they're immigrants or refugees, or and so that could be another part of your series as well. But sexual assault is huge when it comes to domestic violence. And if you're sheltered in and you have lost your power, and your power is constantly being taken away from you, sexual violence, I'm quite sure is a part of that as well.
Thank
I
you.
just wanted to add a statistic that I added to a domestic violence PowerPoint, said that 40 to 45% of women will be sexually assaulted who are experiencing intimate partner abuse. So that's nearly half.
Wow.
And that's from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Oh.
Sa'idah,
Yes, ma'am.
go back to your point.
So just to expound on that a little more, sometimes when you're in a domestic violence situation at that time, what you do not need to do is run to where the children are, because he may hurt them as well. If it's possible, if you can always have a phone accessible at all times, a number to call for help, I mean, and I've said this before, 911 is always on the phone. It's always on a broken phone. It's on an old phone that have no plan. Practice how to get out safely with your children. And simple things. Don't pull in the driveway, back in the driveway. You may need to get out. Who has time to turn around and look around, trying to get out? What are you going to hit? So you park your car. You have to learn to do some things different. Adrienne, you mentioned toilet tissue. If you have a friend that you know that is in abused relationship, allow that to be the code word.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have toilet tissue? Yes or no? And that is the same as saying, do you need to leave or are you all right?
Yes.
So there are some code words that you need to use with your relatives. And believe me, they know when you are in an abusive relationship sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they don't know. But if they do know, make sure these are some code words for them. Even with your children, plan a code word for them so that they can dial 911 to get you out, to get themselves out. Identify safe places in your home. If you know there's guns in the living room, go the other direction. If you know the heat is on, go in the kitchen, go somewhere that, weapons are not as accessible.
Okay, those are very good points that you made. And LaSandra, if you could maybe share with us, so for family or friends of victims of domestic violence, what can they do to help a victim who is currently in a relationship?
Yeah. Just to add to what Sa'idah and Adrienne said as well, to Adrienne's point about some women not having access to technology, there was an article out about how a woman in Europe gave a code word to the pharmacist, and then the pharmacist knew that meant she needed him or her to call 911. And so people are getting creative with safety planning at this point, and how it could be like your neighbor across the street. If I come stand in the front window and do this, call 911. It could be, you may have to get really creative with how to safety plan at this point because of women being sheltered in with abusers. But family and friends, again, I think the main thing is just checking in, is trying to check in, because at this point we're saying social distance, but really it's just physical distance. We don't need to be distancing ourselves from people that we're really in relationship with, especially if we know someone may be at risk or may be in danger or is living and trying to mitigate an abusive partner. So staying connected, checking in. If someone says, okay, if I don't hear from you in 2 days, I know maybe something is wrong. Just having plans with people. If I say, again, a certain code word, that means that I'm in danger. I need someone to come check on me. I need someone to knock on my front door, like call help, call the police. So those are great plans. Also realizing that abusers are leveraging, because of intimate partner abuse is about power and control. They could leverage anything. They could leverage, if you don't do this, I'm not going to let you use the toilet paper. If you don't do this, you can't sleep in the bed. You got to sleep on the floor. I mean, really think, an abuser leverages everything. if
Yeah.
you don't do this, I'm going to kick you out the house. You're not going to have anywhere to go, and you're going to be out here exposed to people that are, have the virus. So there's all kinds of crazy things that could be happening or being said. And so I think trying to stay in community as much as possible with people that we know may be at risk.
Can I just add, I'm so sorry, a little bit on that. There are times in this time now where the abusive partners, they share misinformation about the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
They do that to frighten the survivor or prevent them from seeking medical help. They may have a temperature and they want to go see if something's wrong. They will not allow them to do that. They'll withhold the insurance cards,
Mm-hmm.
the medical plan, I'll cancel the insurance, different things like that. So those are some of the things that are happening with the shut-ins right now. And then you have survivors who are older, who may have chronic heart, issues or lung conditions that will increase in public areas where they won't go because they're afraid of getting the coronavirus. So this shut-in for them is really bad.
Yeah.
I want to just add to family and friends, to know that the domestic violence hotlines are open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So if all else fails, obviously, or you just need help, or you're in relationship with someone who you suspect may be in danger, anyone can access the hotline. There's a national hotline, and then also we have each agency usually has a 24-hour hotline. So
That's good to know as well. And you both, in your responses, the topic of where the husband or intimate partner could potentially put the survivor or the victim out of the house. So and both of you all work with shelters. So could you maybe talk about how are, during this time, during this pandemic, are shelters able, to provide resources for victims if they need to, if they are put out of their home by their abuser? What's happening in that area as far as how are shelters able to respond, considering the times in which, we're dealing with right now with the pandemic?
I'd like to respond to that. What's happening in our area?
Okay.
We all know that shelters are crowded to begin with.
Right.
They are packed to begin with. We cannot accept any more people. We're just to the seams.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one issue that's hard anyway. I'm getting calls that no agencies are taking anyone. And it's hard for them because now they can call a shelter. Even if someone leaves the shelter and have completed their times, they can't let no one else back in. I called one of the shelters to ask them what were they doing for the COVID-19. And what they said to me was, we are not allowing anyone in. We are putting everyone in their rooms, not allowing them to come out. We are bringing their breakfast, lunch, dinner to the rooms. So that puts out a lot of women that are put out of their homes by their husbands. So that forces them to turn around and go back home and continue to put up with abuse. At least right now, there are no more intakes. No one is taking anyone else in the shelter. I mean, you can't blame them, but somebody needs to do something with them. What happens to the women that are just left on the street? I had one that's sleeping on the street. No one would take her in. The homeless shelters are crowded. The DV shelters are crowded. The Salvation Army is crowded. They have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go.
That's pretty.
Yeah, no, shelters, we do know shelters are always in high demand, and there's always an issue with trying to find shelter placement. At the end of the day, people should call the hotline, should call either the national hotline or their local agency's hotline to try to find shelter placement. Like our agency, for example, had some strict criteria for who could be in emergency shelter, which has been changed in response to COVID-19. So there are some agencies that are also following suit, whereas if you in the past maybe wouldn't have been able to access that shelter, those guidelines and criteria are now more flexible so that more people can access it. And just certain policies and procedures are being tweaked in response to COVID-19. So that's something to consider. Also, there is state funding and national funding that is being pushed toward these issues. And so us advocating for how that funding is allocated to address this issue is important, but some agencies are making sure that funding is going to try to address the issue with shelter. There are some shelters as well that everyone has their own room. So it's important to know that there is a possibility you can be in a shelter and still practice some social distancing or physical distancing, just so that people are not completely deterred from entering a shelter.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And a lot of times too, what some of the shelters are doing, if they see it fit in their budget, they're sending people to hotels.
Yeah.
They're sending them to hotels to, and as I said, in their budget, but a lot of the shelters don't have a huge budget. Mm-hmm. So they're doing what they can with what they have.
And I'm just wondering, something just occurred to me, and I don't know if maybe this is an option also. I just recall months ago, I had an incident, not related to this, but I had to go to the police station because someone had stolen the license plates off of a loaner vehicle that I had. And it was in the wintertime, but I noticed at this particular police station, because it was the wintertime, there, were individuals who were homeless who were able to stay inside of the police station at night. And so I'm just wondering, if that is something that you would recommend to victims, if they could get out, or if they have to get out, should they go to the police station, try to file a report also while they're there, but could that also service as a, temporary place holder until they can maybe get in contact with some agencies to see if there's a way to.
What I think is most of the police departments would better have a better reputation with the shelters. Mm-hmm. They probably can get someone in that we couldn't get in.
Okay.
From, them calling and coming, and the police are like, well, I can't leave them on my front door. Mm-hmm. So they may have a better, a easier way to get them in the shelter. I would think so.
The Chicago Police Departments have a DV liaison. So usually, and so we as advocates at the DV agencies usually attend meetings with them, like a monthly meeting, so that there's a partnership and a relationship. So I do think that could be a good idea, Aginah, and a possibility of, if all else failed, going to the police station and asking there. Also, I was just going to make mention too, sometimes sitting in the car could be helpful, because we're in an economic downturn, because we're sheltered in, tension is high. So if somebody is already abusive, it could be that there's a moment of raging, or where someone doesn't feel safe, that if they just went and got in the car, perhaps with kids, if that's a possibility, that is another safety planning strategy.
Okay, that's good information to know. Adrienne, I wanted to ask you, what are some resources that are available to women who are victims of sexual assault that you could share?
Yeah. So just like domestic violence, every state has a coalition against sexual assault. And normally every rape crisis center and or DV organization, some of them are dual organizations, they're members of the coalition of that state. So if people are not familiar with the local rape crisis center in their community, they can always look up the state coalition, and the state coalition will have a list of all the member agencies throughout the whole state. And also our campuses now have, Title IX, they do have advocates to help students, and they don't just have to be undergrad. Some of them are grad students that can assist them. We also have even the military. So I highly suggest that people contact their local rape crisis centers, but if they're not familiar with that, they can always call their state coalition or look on the state coalition's website. There's also national organizations that have 24-hour hotlines as well. As I stated, there's military, and some people are not even familiar that there's PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. There's actual advocates that assist incarcerated survivors as well. So, and it doesn't just have to be a prison. It could be a county facility. It could be a juvenile detention facility, a state facility, as well as federal. So there's so many different systems that work with victim survivors and also have a connection to the state coalitions.
That's good information. Also, I think it would also behoove us to have a conversation at a later date about victims of both sexual assault and domestic violence who have fought back and, who are now incarcerated because they fought back against their abuser. So that's definitely a topic that I'd like to explore, because oftentimes with the increase of women who are incarcerated, it's usually because
because they were defending themselves. And also, may I say this also, there was a report that the CDC, the Center of Disease and Control report from 2017 about African-American women having some of the highest homicidal rates due to intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And some of the reasons that Black women were not reporting, they also had Indigenous women, our numbers are astronomical. A lot of times we don't report because of the stigma and the biases when it comes to Black women. Also the intimate partner violence in our own communities. Sometimes we are such a victim blaming society, but also in our communities. So that is a great report to take a look at, how Black women our numbers are extremely high when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault, and why we do not report. And a lot of times we are not reporting because of systemic issues, institutional issues, biases against us, and also within our communities. And we have this protectionism for, if our perpetrators are Black and from our community, we have this protectionism for them, right? And so at the end of the day, we're protecting our men in our community while we are being violated and victimized, and is causing us to carry on trauma from one generation to the next. And also we are holding that in. Anything that goes unaddressed can become critical, can become chronic. And so I'm highly concerned about that as well.
There was something that just internalizing all of this, and then with you all working in this field, I know when we started, you talked about how some days, it could be a struggle.
Yeah.
How do you all, what do you do to deal with all of the things that you see, how do you take care of yourself? Because that can be, I'm sure, emotionally and mentally draining as well. So how do you all handle just working in this field?
Yeah, I'll let them go since I just finished talking.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I have a therapist that I can pick up the phone at any given time and call. I have friends that have their LCSWs that I can always pick up the phone and just, lay on them and boo-hoo and whatever the case may be. But for the most part, and I will tell you, I have my husband. You talk about pillow talk. My pillow talk is a little different than some other people's pillow talk. My pillow talk is, do you remember the lady that called me yesterday whose husband punched her and shattered her whole eye socket? So that is my pillow talk with him. And I'll tell you, some of the things he say to me is, you can't save the world. You can only do what you can do. You can't get upset if she goes back after all you've done. So, he has really, really helped me along with understanding what I do. He's a Muslim man.
Mhm.
And as I said before, there are Muslim men that are beating their wives. And this is a man that has taken what I do for a living and figured, let me jump on the bandwagon and help where I can. And that is exactly what he's done. So I do the girly stuff. I do a massage. I walk around the house dancing like I'm on some old show. But whatever I can do that will help me is what I do. Hot baths, candles, all that kind of stuff. And we have to remember the self-care. We have to pamper our own selves. And the one thing we have to do is be grateful that these are not positions that we are in.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's so good. That's so good. Yeah, absolutely. Same with me, self-care, stepping away from the internet, stepping away from the work sometimes to just do something fun, to get out, go on a walk with my kids, watch a movie, cook, clean, decorate. Sometimes playing in my hair, playing in makeup, just whatever fun things to just kind of like relax for a minute, because right now, obviously, it's a time of a lot of turmoil. So I think all of us are experiencing some level of just vicarious trauma, even if we don't personally know people, in our circle. But the fact that so much is happening to people, and so when you're empathetic and you care, there's no way to not feel it. So I think that same, I also have a counselor, and so my counselor also will remind me, like, LaSandra, yeah, you can't do everything. You have to take care of you first, because if we don't take care of ourselves, we really are no good to anybody else. So
that's the same as the airplane advice.
yes.
Put on your oxygen mask first, because if you don't, you can't help the next person.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what I tend to do is I hold on to my faith. Being a victim and dealing with some trauma, while I was married and after I was married, I had to hold on to my faith so I would not conform to my flesh. I'm just being real. And so that's another reason why I have the Faith Project. My CalCASA, California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, has really afforded me the opportunity to work for faith organizations to address sexual violence and DV and the prevention of child sexual abuse. And I, sought that out because it was the faith community who have helped me. I was not very forgiving. It took me a very, very long time to forgive. I just started forgiving last year. Like, that's how long it has taken me. And so I hold on to my faith. I'm part of my faith communities. But I do like music. Like the other day I was listening to house music. I was listening to Jungle Brothers, I'm a House You Up. So there's times I had to listen to music. There's times that I miss being at home in Chicago because I'm all the way out here in the West Coast without my family. And now I'm here with my fiance. But there's times that I start listening to Sam Cooke. I start listening to Minnie Riperton. I get a feel for Chicago. But most importantly, I have this great support system that I could talk with. And if I have to cry and scream and language alert. There's times I don't want to use profanity, but there's just some days I'm just like, this is insane. Like, we are chasing after crisis and sexual violence and domestic violence. And I want us to get to a point where we could get ahead of that. Right. And so there's days that I just have to listen to music, and there's some days I just dive into carbs. I know I shouldn't, but I just dive into carbs, and I'm gonna be honest. There's sometimes I'm happy I'm not at Chicago because I'll be at Garrett's Popcorn, I'll be at Chino's Pizza, I'll be at White Castle. That just doesn't make sense, right? However, at that moment, I got to do what I have to do so I don't allow the vicarious trauma to take over me. So I allow rainbow sherbet to take over. I allow, other things to take over. But most importantly, I have a great support system. And my colleagues, and I have my LEAP sisters, and Sa'idah and I are part of this program, LEAP, which stands for Leadership, Education, and leadership, education, advancement for professionals. It's for
Right.
women of color in the anti-sexual violence movement. And so we have different cohorts. And so I'm from cohort 1, and I'm the coordinator, and Sa'idah's from cohort 3. But we have this, Facebook page, but each cohort have their peers. And so to be able to have peers and a support system outside of your other support system, who knows exactly what our work consists of, when I could call and say, girl.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I don't have to say nothing else,
Yeah.
just girl.
Yeah.
So that's how I handle it. But at the end of the day, after that, I feel even more energized, like, okay, we're going to get this taken care of for our girls, for our daughters, and for our community, right? And then we have to have the meetings of the mind. How are we going to work with this? And how are we going to encourage and help protect our sisters who are victims, not by anything they have done. It's because they're with someone who wants power and control.
Right. And I know, Adrienne, you have another meeting that you have to get to.
I do.
I just want to, before we wrap up, because we're going to have this conversation again, we have to. It's very important. You mentioned even when you started, when we started this this conversation, that there are so many of African American women, Black women, who are victims of abuse, yet they don't see advocates who look like them or people working in the field.
No.
Why do you think that is, and what can we do to get more women like us involved in the field so that, victims will have someone that they can relate to and understand and who can advocate for them?
I'm gonna say my experience, and one of the reasons why LEAP has come about, is that a lot of women of color, we work in silos. We work in these organizations where there's barely anyone to look like us. There's a lot of time, overwhelmingly, there's not enough succession planning for us. There's no one trying to mentor or coach us to stay in this field and to be in decision-making positions in these fields. So this field is a feminist movement. And we know women of color started the feminist movement, but unfortunately, a lot of women of color are not in decision-making positions in this movement. And also, I'm gonna be honest, from my experience as being a DV victim, I didn't come across any woman of color when I had to go to court or speak with victim services through the court system or the local DV system. So it's barely any of us here. And some of us that are here, some of us have been exited out and not by our own decisions. This movement has some challenges of having women of color in decision-making positions. When I spoke about coalitions, every state has a coalition. It's rare that there's a Black woman or a woman of color that's in a decision-making position. And we have 50 states that have coalitions, not including our 4 territories as well.
Wow.
So that's the challenge. And then some of the organizations that do have us, sometimes we're there because we're tokenized. We're there to be the face to work with the communities of color, but we're not there to be in decision-making positions to help shape policies and procedures and practices that would be advantageous to our community and that will have a better cultural lens for our community.
Thank you for that. Well, it looks like we've got work to do.
Yes.
At least to talk about that, because that's something that's not discussed anyway, that there aren't many of us in decision-making roles. Before we wrap up, because I want to be respectful of your time, I'd like for you all to, if you can, to give 1 or 2 tips for our listeners to kind of walk away with if they are victims of abuse, or if it's a family or friend who knows someone who is victim of abuse. And then also, I believe I did read that you can still, although we're practicing social distancing, sheltering in place across many states across the country, victims of abuse can still obtain an order of protection during this time. Is that not correct?
That is totally correct.
Okay. So, Adrienne, I know you just answered the last question, but I want to make sure, be able to get you in. If you could provide 1 or 2 tips takeaways for us to be mindful of as it relates to domestic violence or sexual assault?
I think, and I'm gonna do it from a Black woman's perspective, I think that we have to make sure that we do not blame the victim for being victimized, and do not ask her what she could have done differently so the perpetrator would have made better choices not to abuse her. I think that also we have to also do not equate that if a woman stays in a domestic violence situation that she lacks confidence. I think that we have to also be mindful, maybe she was a nurturing woman who really brought into her relationship, and unfortunately, the partner did not buy into it and nor invest in it the way that she did. So let's not victimize victims by asking them what they could have done differently. And let's not view victims of domestic violence as someone who has low self-esteem. I think we have to also think about the fact that maybe she was a mature one and she tried to help more in that relationship. Maybe she should have left. And I would use myself as an example. You know, trying to save a relationship when other person has not bought into it and don't have the same level of investment, that could be detrimental to the victim as well.
Thank you. Sa'idah.
Adrienne, I am agreeing with everything you said, and I'm adding 10 pounds. One of the things that I think we need to do is believe her, believe her, believe her.
Yeah.
Don't, when she comes to you with this is what's happening because he's Romeo out in the street, you have to believe what she's saying.
Yeah.
Do not look at her and say, I don't think he can do that. That's just not him. That's not his personality. Believe her. Help her get from point A to point B. If she's trying to get away, help her. Don't turn your back, because this is not a you problem. It's our problem. This is a problem that we all share. We have people who's afraid, I don't want to get involved. If meaning get involved by sliding her a number to talk to someone else, get involved. If it means that you can send her, ride her, take her, put her in the car, drop her off at the police station, please believe her. Believe her is all I can really say.
Thank you. And LaSandra.
Yeah, absolutely. Echoing what both of the ladies shared. But also just even in this pandemic time, in this time of crisis, just to survivors and to their family and friends, knowing that there is help. Help, just because we're sheltered in, help has not disappeared. Advocates all over the country and all over the world are working hard to strategize on how to stay consistent. There's legal advocacy, help getting an order of protection, telehealth, counseling, safety planning, access to emergency shelter, access to all kinds of advocacy and safety. So I just want to echo that, like, just because we're not out does not mean that people have turned a blinded eye to this issue. So call the hotline, encourage people that you think may not be safe to call the hotline, to safety plan, to come up with code words, being proactive and staying in community and constantly checking in is really, really imperative right now.
Thank you so much, ladies, for taking time out of your day to just share information about this very important topic. We just scratched the surface, if that. So I want to publicly invite you to come back so that we can continue the conversation. So I want to do that pretty soon. So of course, if you agree, I want to work with you to get something else scheduled, because I think this is very, very important. So thank you again so much for taking time to share some insightful information with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. I really appreciate it. And taking the time to have this podcast, especially during this COVID-19.
Right, very important.
Yes.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you so much for putting this together and inviting us on.
Thank you, ladies. Well, you all enjoy the rest of your day. And as I always leave my listeners with, I tell them to make sure that they remember to light it up and shine bright like a diamond. 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime, and nearly 1 in 5 women have been raped in their lifetime. If you are in danger, call 911, a local hotline, or the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The National Domestic Violence Hotline provides confidential and anonymous support 24/7. Reach out by phone at 1-800-799-7233. If you are a victim of sexual assault and need access to resources, call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. Thanks for joining me this week on Light It Up. Make sure you visit my website at www.lightituppodcast.com or www.aginahmuhammad.com. You can also find me on social media using the handle @LightItUpPodcast. If you like what you've heard, please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, I'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or you can simply tell a friend about the show. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode. Until next time, light it up and shine bright like a diamond.